Well, firstly, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This is such an important part of our history. And as Duran said earlier, I think that this book, Mensches in the Trenches, says something very important about South African history, but it says something very important that goes beyond South African history. And I must tell you, I have to give, and it's not just, and I'm not paid to be here, but it's not just because I'm officially here. I can really highly recommend this book. It's a most delightful book to read. It's called Mensches in the Trenches, Jewish Foot Soldiers in the Anti-Apartheid Struggle. It sounds like it could be quite a heavy book. It's not. It's just a heartwarming book, very often moving, very often funny. And I have to give credit to the author, Jonathan Ansah, who's really, what he said was really, really important. He said that we could have and to our credit, we could have a telephone book with all the names and a line or two about what various people did in the struggle against apartheid. But what he really wanted to do was get the stories, a little bit of a sense of a story. And, you know, Jews love stories. We all love stories. And I think that that's what he managed to achieve. This is not just a sort of litany of good acts, if I can put it that way. These are heartwarming stories, heartbreaking stories. They're stories about oppression, and they're stories about overcoming oppression through courage and bravery. And that's really what we want to acknowledge today, is we all know many of we've had our beautiful big book, Jewish Memories of Mandela, where we honored the big names, the really big names, the Joe Slovos, etc., who we recognize as anti-apartheid activists. But this is a book about sometimes big, sometimes small kindnesses, and the price that were paid by people and their courage. And that's what stood out for me. And we might get a chance, the incredible courage of people who saw injustice being done and stood up against it, and their beautiful stories. So that's what the book's about. It's lovely, lovely reading, easy reading, inspirational reading. So I really want to advise every single person here to read it. Which gets me on to the whole point of the exercise today, and that's to talk to you, Paul. What we've got is the opportunity to really talk to somebody who certainly I want to ask you a little bit about your father. He's been in some of the big, Arthur Goldrush is well known, but some of the smaller stories I didn't know that he was a costume designer. I don't know if that's accurate, but you can tell us more about that. And if you could just share with us some of the stories about your father and how it felt growing up in the home that you did.
Okay. I just wondered, has Nicholas joined yet or not?
No.
No. Okay, fine. Okay, well, if I just sort of focus on growing up in the Goldreich household, I mean, it was a very, it was a confusing place to grow up, really. We moved out of Johannesburg to Liliesleaf. And so we moved from Parktown, originally Isipingo Street, then Parktown, and then to Liliesleaf. And of course, Liliesleaf was a totally different ballgame. It was a farm. It was huge. We had 24 acres. There was a lot of, from a child's point of view, it was a kind of miraculous place because there was a huge open space for us to explore and run around. But then equally there was this other aspect to it, which was that there were a lot of people on the farm whom we didn't know, but we got to know. And Madiba was one of them, and of course he wasn't known to us as Nelson at all. He was known as David, and he often walked around the farm in blue overalls. Apparently the other farm workers didn't know who he was. But then, of course, there was this massive contradiction going on, which was that at certain points there were meetings being held both in his room, but also in the main house, in the dining room, which had a large table in it, dining table, around which sat the higher echelon of the ANC, and particularly Umkhonto we Sizwe. And so as a sort of 6-year-old, it was all very intriguing and very interesting, being in an environment with people discussing politics generally. There's one story that my mother likes to tell, which is that I used to spend quite a lot of time sitting under the table listening to these debates. And there was one story my mother tells, which is about me coming out after a meeting and saying to her, "Bloody Americans," and it was in relation to the fact that the Americans wouldn't fund the ANC. So there was a lot of that going on. There was a lot of kind of what I would call sort of incipient politicization going on in those meetings. And then we kind of lived this very odd life. There was a lot of stuff going on the farm, and I mean that included afternoon walks with Madiba around the farm, where and doing all sorts of things with him, playing basketball, football, archery, and rifle shooting, which he used to enjoy doing, and so did we. Knife throwing was something else that we also did quite a lot of. Yeah, it was quite extraordinary stuff going on. But these walks were lovely because it meant that we could have time with him, and he knew an enormous amount about the flora and fauna of Southern Africa, and he taught us a lot about. He taught us how to make fires, for example, but he also taught us a lot about snakes and a lot about insects and all that sort of thing. So he was an extremely knowledgeable man, and very kind and very good. But it was complex. Obviously, it was extremely complex. So we would go to school in Saxonwold, and then we would come back to the farm, and these two worlds were very divided and very separate. My parents were, I mean, that was complex because they were engaged in multiple lives, really. My mother was a nursery school teacher, and my father was a designer, architect, revolutionary, and artist. So if you combine that into a package, it's a complex package. And so it was very very confusing. But of course, for us, it sort of melded together, really. But yeah, talking about costumes, he was the artistic director for King Kong. So that was going on in the early 60s, and he was very absorbed. Apart from his work with the ANC, he was very absorbed in that. I mean, this was always a very complicated bit, in a way, in understanding him as a child, as his child, was essentially how you can live multiple lives and still function, and that's a very complex question, really, because he was really, he was always working, and he was always doing different things. So, at one time, in the day, he would be in his painting studio on the farm. He'd be painting, And then he would be in a meeting with Madiba, and then he would be designing a building, and then he would be, going downtown and working on the set of King Kong. That's and in fact, he was always like that. I mean, even after the escape and once he was in Israel, his life was very like that. It was very, he was a busy guy, basically.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing those stories with us. They really are fascinating. I mean, what you're saying about the complexity, and I think being a child and recognizing the complexity in a parent is a theme that I've picked up a few times, actually.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, we interviewed LB Sachs,
Yeah.
his father, Solly Sachs. And he tells a story. I think he was turning 6. I could be wrong. I could have said he was turning 6, and his father wrote him a letter to something about be a good soldier for the revolution. And I said, that's quite a remarkable letter. And he said, yes, and it's also quite a heavy burden for a child to
Oh,
read.
huge.
And I think that, I think that the stories you're talking about, and I think that's also partly about these Mensches in the trenches, is they were complex people who led complex lives, and their families were enormously impacted positively.
They were massively impacted. I mean, I think that's the other thing. I think also one of the really important things is also the role of women in this whole story. Because of course, my mother was deeply involved in this, as were many other women, Ruth Slovo, and I mean many other women. Also, all of those women who were involved in the Black Sash, and generally, Helen Suzman, and generally the women who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And this was in a sense the underbelly of all of that resistance, and all of that struggle was also going on. Both white women and black women and Indian women were all involved in that process, which is very, very important. It's, I think often the men are positioned in a very particular way in this story, but actually the women, I mean, my mother was at night going out driving members of the high command all over, risking her life doing these things, and so that is also a very, very important aspect to this whole drama, really, is the role of women. Sorry, go on.
Oh, thank you. I was going to ask you 2 questions, but one more has come up thanks to what you were saying, and it's really you painted a portrait of Madiba, of Mandela, as you saw him as a child. And obviously, Black South Africans saw the leadership and the capacity that he had. And now we recognize him for the iconic leader he was. And it's hard to ask a child to do this about a parent, but what do you think? I mean, your father obviously recognized something, taking him onto the farm, protecting him at great risk. So many South Africans really saw him at the time as nothing more than a agitator, terrorist, whatever.
Oh, absolutely.
What was it in your father that you think allowed him to recognize? As I said, it was perhaps easy for Black South Africans to do it, but what was it about a white man, a white Jewish man perhaps, that enabled him to recognize this within him?
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, I think that statement about Black South Africans recognizing it is a complicated story as well, because of course, the political landscape was very mixed and very confused. And you're talking about a group of Black freedom fighters, effectively, who connected themselves with staunch Jewish communists. I mean, seriously staunch Stalinist, essentially. I mean, the South African Communist Party was the second most vehement communist party in the world next to Russia. And so you've got a lot of Jews whose families, all of whom essentially were coming from Lithuania, whose families had traveled from Russia after the revolution or before the revolution. In my mother's family's case, before the revolution in 1914, essentially. A lot of them were, deeply communist. Dennis Goldberg's family were seriously communistic. Joe Slovo's family was. My father, I had conversations with him about his connection to the Communist Party. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't where they were, put it that way. My mother's family were much more connected to the Communist Party than my father's. My father's family were merchants, and were also English. That's another aspect. But I think my father's position really came from the Holocaust. I mean, that was the root. That was, for him, that was the root of his basic hatred of the apartheid system. Because in it, I think he could see the reverberations of Nazism within South Africa. And he really opposed that. He was sickened by that, effectively. So after his experience in 1948 in Israel, actually his relationship to, here comes Nicholas. And my father's relationship to the Palmach is questionable, but nevertheless, the point is that he fought. He came at the.
Hello, guys.
Hi. He came at the end of the 48 war to Israel. But the point is that that his experience within Israel was the thing that connected him to Mandela, because Mandela knew that he had some military experience, but he was also under the radar because no one knew him in South Africa, because he'd been in Israel and then he'd been in England in the 50s, in the early 50s. So when my parents left England, came back to South Africa, my father was, and because he was non-politicized, basically. I mean, he wasn't a political agent. He was a designer. So he was under the radar. And I think in a way it was the other way around. Mandela saw something in my father that could be very useful to them. And my father's link was concretized because he was already beginning to have thoughts and views about the need to dismantle the apartheid state.
Thank you. I mean, I find it fascinating that the connection was the Palmach. I mean, whatever, as you say, whatever the position was, it really is fascinating that, Mandela's connection there. It's really wonderful to hear that sitting in Israel, I have to say. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Well, he went with my mother's cousin, who was his best friend, a chap called David Fine. And they went to a brand new kibbutz in the northern Galilee called Mayam Baruch, which had a number of South Africans there. And that was a Palmach stronghold, Mayam Baruch.
It was.
And David Fine's wife, Ruti, was in the Palmach when they arrived.
She was.
Yeah, so that's the connection.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. I think one of the reasons why we write the book is for these really amazing pieces of information to come through. So Nick, we've spoken a bit, and maybe I'll give you the joy of, I think you wanted to open to the audience. So let's maybe open to the audience and we can take it from there. But I think if we can maybe just get some, just get some audience questions and then see if there's anything more we want to discuss.
Well,
they're in London. You guys are in England.
Yeah,
we are. Yeah, I'm in London and Paul's in Eastbourne.
So we wanted to get them to speak, but obviously That's okay. Thank you.
And so we open to questions, and then we'll repeat the questions Paul and Nicholas can hear. So are there any questions from the audience you'd like to ask? Yes, please introduce yourself.
My name is Stanley Rodney, and I'm not asking a question, I'm just making a fact. The fact is that I'm representing two people who were very much part of the struggle. That is the Cohen family and the Edelstein family. My wife, Barbara Cohen, can't be here today, Rodney's Day, because she's babysitting. And Gideon, Barbara's brother is in South Africa at the moment. The connection between Gideon and the apartheid system was Gideon was in house arrest for 2 years in 1976 until 1978, and because of his involvement in the Biko incident, and I told him in South Africa that I'm going to mention it. The connection between Gideon Cohen and Edelstein is that Edelstein was murdered in Soweto in 1976. So the Cohen, the Edelstein family are very much part of the struggle. I said to Gideon, under all circumstances, I'm going to mention it here because I think it's a big tribute to those two people. Noble, incidentally, was regarded after he was murdered by the regime of the South African regime as someone who worked for them. And it took a long time, only after the apartheid system cracked, that black people made it very clear that there was no connection between him and the system. It was just that unfortunately, he was there at the time and was murdered. So I just thought I'd just mention it, and thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, I think we're going to need another book. And I really do think that those are stories that need to be told. And you want to talk about the bar mitzvah, Wendy?
Because it was such a beautiful story. Sorry, my name is Wendy Khan. I'm from the Jewish Board. I'm trying to think, it was about 6 years ago, on June 16, we took a group of high school, actually the matrics, from some of our Jewish schools to Soweto to remember June 16. And we attended the bar mitzvah of Melville Edelstein's grandson at the site where he was murdered. And they laid, the city of Johannesburg laid a plaque there. And all of it was really, the mayor was there, the premier, the many different government ministers there.
I was there. They brought the Torah. They set up this little on the corner.
He read from the Torah at the start. It was one of the most moving and beautiful, and he really was given an unbelievable, it was such a beautiful tribute to him. And we were so privileged that our high school children were there to actually witness that.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Any questions to the gold rights question? Yeah, John.
Can I have two questions?
Okay, as a Telfed volunteer, you get 2 questions.
I thought I was paid.
So introduce yourself.
I'm John Martin. I think he's the chairman of Karen Telfed, not Robbie. We're the fundraising of Zionist State. Two questions. One's a remark, and I'd like a reaction. My feeling was there's always been that the Jews were very heavily represented out of proportion to the population in the struggle, which is parallel to what happened, I guess, in the civil rights movement. Nevertheless, the vast majority of South African Jews lived very comfortably with it. And I was wondering how you felt about that. The second question was about the number of activists in the struggle in the ANC who were very anti-Zionist. I'm talking about Jews who were active in the struggle and were very anti-Zionist. Today they would be, some of them still are, supporters of BDS. I was wondering about your reaction to that.
They still are anti-Zionist. They still are, friends of ours. It's a bugbear of mine, to be absolutely honest. I find it offensive, but not everyone agrees with me.
I mean, there's a long, in fact, I was discussing this with someone last night who was asking me, a guy from the BBC, who was asking me about this very question. And there's I don't know if anyone has seen it, but there's a YouTube clip of Mandela at a meeting with Ted Koppel in America. I don't know if anyone's seen that. In which Ted Koppel asks him, what's the relationship essentially between the ANC and Israel, and their position on Palestine. And Mandela makes a very clear statement, and he says that Israel is a racist state that is working against the interests, obviously, of the Palestinian people, and that as a revolutionary organization, the ANC will support the revolutionary movement of the PLO. And I think that this was the position that the ANC took and still continues to take from very early on. And it affected, certainly that position affected my father's relationship with the ANC until Mandela was released. But it also affected Dennis Goldberg's relationship, who, of course, was released to Israel from prison. And
Dennis also, when he was released, he agreed to become non-violent, or to
renounce. The deal was that he should renounce violence.
Yeah,
and the ANC,
and he got a lot of criticism within the ANC for doing that. But I think a lot of that was based on the fact that the deal to get him out was brokered through Israel, and that he was released to Israel, as you said. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a deal that was brokered through my cousin David Fine, through one of the Labour MPs in Israel, and my father. It was a deal that was brokered with the South African government, and the ANC response to it was very negative.
It is. It's a fairly sort of typical breakdown between supporting Israel and supporting the Palestinians. Just to move away from South Africa, I've got a daughter in Belfast in Northern Ireland. If you drive through the streets of Belfast, you will see pro-Palestinian posters and paintings in the Catholic areas, and in the Protestant areas, you'll see pro-IDF posters. It's a way of identifying who you are, whether you are. Yeah.
No, but it's importantly, it's the political affiliative position, basically. And this is, in a way, this is the biggest problem and contradiction, because Nicholas and I both agree on this fundamental point. If you look at, when Joe Slovo, before Joe died, he was asked, what do you think about your relationship and your connection with the Stalinists in Russia? Do you have any recrimination or problem with it? And he said very clearly, I think there were some excesses. Well, I mean, you're talking about 80 million people murdered by the Stalin regime. You're talking about another 80 million or 1 billion people murdered in China. Come on. The left have always denied their connection with that reality. And
it's continuing. Sorry, Paulie, it's continuing today. On social media, there's if anything happens between Israel and Gaza, the social media is flooded with it. There's so little, and I mean from former South Africans, nothing about Ukraine at all. They will not criticize Russia. Paul's absolutely right.
But it's also very interesting because fortunately now the Labour Party in Britain have kicked out Jeremy Corbyn. But the reality of the situation is that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite through and through, and he talked often about his great friends in Hezbollah and the other revolutionary movements in quotes. Now, I'm not just talking about in Palestine, all over the place. Cuba and the rest. The reality of the situation, and I understand if people are a bit kind of confused by Nick and my response to this political position, but basically the point is this: we grew up in a situation where our parents were connected to a revolutionary movement that was essentially linked to the Communist Party. Okay, Madiba was not a communist, but the groundwork, all the serious groundwork, was being done by the Jewish communists. And the reality of the situation is that when you grow up in an environment where you're indoctrinated essentially to believe that communism is right and capitalism is wrong, which is exactly what Nick and I were brought up to believe. Eventually, you come to the conclusion at a certain point in your life, when you've got a bit of understanding and knowledge about the world, you come to the conclusion this is total ideological fabrication, and that and my father sat in a way very uncomfortably in this whole political debate. In 1983, my father was interviewed by The Guardian, during which time he said that Israel was an apartheid state. Okay, and yet he was essentially a Zionist.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you right.
Well, I'm sorry. I've just got one more. I've got one more thing to add to that, which is quite interesting. My dad trained, as Paul said, he trained in communist countries. He was in China. He got training in China, and he got training in Russia. And one of his minders in Russia was a KGB colonel. And sometime during this process, they both discovered that they were Jewish. And my dad said they both got up and gave each other a big hug. And then the KGB guy went back to minding him,
Okay, lovely story. Thank you. And I think there's quite a lot of whitewashing of those struggle activists and apartheid and Zionists. So it's really nice to hear you say it. There are a few more questions. We're going to have to keep it very short, though.
Just introduce yourself, please.
My name is Jeff Lederer. I'd like to ask Nicholas, what was it like growing up in that household? Because your brother said it was complex, but he also described it as being a Garden of Eden as far as a young boy with going on walks with Mandela and listening to him speak and the vast expanse of the farm. How did you find that upbringing?
Yeah, it was very interesting. We had an interesting childhood, to say the least. As a child, you are very adaptable, and when you become an adult, you forget how adaptable children were. You just adapt to your environment, and that was the culture we grew up in. On the one hand, as you say, we lived on a farm. We had a huge area to play in, which was full of snakes, for example, very poisonous snakes. And we lived a life of sort of country squires. We lived in an area where it was very sort of horse orientated. A lot of the kids in my class, their dads played polo. My old man had a horse.
It was
used to go riding. It was very affluent, yeah. And on the other hand, we had people at our house who were trying to overthrow the government. And I can remember, for example, walking past an open window and watching my father coaching Nelson Mandela in his delivery of a speech, because as you know, his delivery in English was sometimes quite difficult to understand. And so my dad was coaching him to give this speech. And a guy I subsequently worked with and became friendly with in London, he was radicalized by this very radio broadcast. He was coaching him for a radio broadcast. This guy called Billy Nanan, who, as I say, I worked with briefly in London, was radicalized by it. So it was an exciting time. It was very exciting. There were things happening, you know. You'd see on a Sunday afternoon, they'd all be out there on the lawn, blazing away with pistols at targets, you know, man-shaped targets on the lawn. We had a huge lawn. It was about the size of a football pitch out front, our lawn. And they put up a target and they were blazing away at the target. I mean, how they thought they were going to remain unseen or unheard, I just don't know. They were unbelievably naive.
They were unbelievably naive.
They were unbelievably naive.
There was a long drive up to the main road, and I remember very clearly going up the road in my father's Citroen, and there were two guys at the top of a telegraph pole. And I remember very clearly saying to my father, "Who are those people?" He said, "No, you don't need to worry about those guys. Those guys were special branch. This was about a month before the raid. And so they were observing everything. And the other thing was, there was a boy across the road called George Mellis, who was a friend of ours, who was coming down to the farm on a very regular basis and writing down the car plate, license plate numbers of all the cars that were coming in and out of the farm. His parents owned a like a holiday kind of camp,
caravan park.
A caravan park. He was taking the numbers down, giving them to his old man, who was giving them to the police. He also said, you know, why are there so many Bantus coming in and out of the farm? So
we,
you know,
it was a very weird mixture between the most idyllic life and and this sort of revolutionary plotting going on at the same time. But for us kids, in answer to your question at long last, it wasn't a difficult thing to, to square that circle, really. We went to school, we had a nice life, and this was something that went on in our house, really, and the surrounding buildings.
Until it ended.
It ended rather suddenly, yeah.
And
I don't
badly.
know if we've got time for another question. I think we need to, I don't know if you'll be able to join us. We've got one more person that we want to speak to tonight, and I hope you'll both remain, and maybe there'll be time afterwards.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late to join.
I just want to really thank you. I think it's been fascinating to hear and to share your stories.
Greatest of pleasure.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how wonderful it's been. But we're not quite finished, so you can continue with your program.
Can I say one more thing as you're sitting in Israel? We went to Israel in 1965. When we arrived there, that was the Garden of Eden in those days. Every single person in the country was an immigrant. Everyone, the state had only been in existence for 17 years at that stage. It was absolute paradise. We used to go to school from 8:30 in the morning till 1 o'clock. We'd take our bikes down to the beach. You just leave your bike at the entrance to the beach, the Sharon beach or something like that, to spend the afternoon on the beach. It was absolutely wonderful.
What a lovely story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I hope, as I said, I hope you'll stay, because I think I really hope you'll stay. Please stay on with us.
No, sure.
There are more comments,
No
there's
problem.
more stories, so please stay on. I don't know how we should, I don't know how we could leave the camera. I'm just going to call you Rabbi, because it seems like my names today are
David.
Thanks, David. All right. So again, welcome firstly, and thank you very much for joining me. I'll leave you, perhaps I can let you introduce yourself. That's probably the easiest thing to do, because I do seem to have skipped some of the introductions sometimes, and just say who you are, and then we can talk a bit about your father. And I haven't, apropos those moment about the women in the struggle, I'm not going to forget about your mother either. So go ahead.
She's actually part of the story.
Exactly.
And I think the Goldbright brothers mentioned that, how the role of women were
Exactly.
often kind of
Yeah.
in the background, but actually were very much part of the story. So my name is, here I'm known as David Benjamin, but originally David Benjamin. And from Cape Town, for the most part, but actually born in East London, which is actually part of my dad's story, in East London. We also lived in the UK.
Well, sorry, David. I'm actually in East London as we speak.
Oh, no,
The real East London.
the other one. Yeah. Well, there you go. But actually, to connect that, my dad was brought up in the East End of London.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so there is that connection. So he was brought up in the East End, but I was born in East London.
Was London.
West London, South African version. Okay. And I mean, briefly, so most of the time was brought up in Cape Town, went to university in Cape Town, UCT, made Aliyah to Israel straight after that, very much under the influence of my dad, who I should maybe point out was a staunch Zionist, like probably above everything else. We'll talk about that. And actually, most of my life in Israel I spent in the army. I joined the army kind of really early on as a lawyer, because I studied law in Cape Town, and my kind of grew into the field of international law, which I basically learned on the job in the military here. I wasn't intending to spend a long time in the army, but I ended up spending about 20 years in the army. Retired now about 14 years ago from there. Still do Miluim, actually Miluim this week. And but in those 14 years, I studied for the rabbinate. in the Reform movement in the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. So my dad's kind of, the expectation that I would go into my dad's business sort of caught up to me eventually. So now I'm kind of a combination between a lawyer and a rabbi here in Israel. And I just mentioned my wife here is Nancy from Argentina originally. One of our next generation is represented, Naor. And of course, my mom is, who I say is very much part of the story.
So your dad's chapter is labeled, for those of you, most of you haven't read the book, obviously, is labeled a Kippah of Hope. And I really do think that, and the Kippah of Hope refers to one of the stories in the book. And I think this is one of, and I'm so pleased actually that we've got this combination of people to speak here, Lily's Leaf and Mandela, through to stories of just really small acts of rebellion and small acts of kindness that were so impactful. And perhaps you could tell us a few stories, about your dad.
I'll try not to say everything that's in the book because we have to leave some stuff for the reader.
What was your father's name?
Sorry.
I suppose. Okay, so, well, his name was Meyer, but he was known to everybody as Sonny. And as I say, he was brought up in the East End of London. And I think it's important to point out that he actually he fought in the Second World War in the British Army. And I think that was a very, very formative experience for him, very, very much shaped his views going forward. There's an Israeli connection here, which is worth pointing out too. At some stage, he was injured. He had a bad fall during his service. And where was he brought to recover? To what was then called Sarafan, which is now called Srifin. There was a military hospital there. And that's where he claims he became a Zionist. So he resolved from then on that, like, eventually the family would end up here. And that was the point. Of course, we took a kind of circuitous, 40 years in the desert before coming here, but eventually we ended up that way. Came to South Africa. I mean, I understand the situation was that after the war, everyone was getting demobilized at the same time. People didn't know what to do. He was told he had a cousin in Cape Town, went to Cape Town. One thing led to another, got involved in the congregation, the relatively newly formed Reform congregation in Cape Town. And eventually became a kind of unofficial rabbi. Met my mom somewhere in Durban, I think. But the story starts in terms of what's interesting, what the book is concerned about, in East London. East London, I'm talking about now in the 60s, more or less, was actually kind of a center for anti-apartheid activity, right? Biko. I know it's a bit murky, okay? All the family memory here is a bit murky. So we just have like individual memories. We never thought at the time to document this kind of thing. It's not like today where you would have movies. And so it's a bit murky. But my father was very involved with a Christian minister whose name was Rob Robertson. And Rob Robertson was known for having set up the first multiracial church in South Africa after the imposition of apartheid, which he did in East London, and afterwards apparently did it in Johannesburg too. And my dad, being the minister, so to speak, one of the ministers of the Jewish community, got very involved with that. Now, I should point out, my father was not a radical. He was not a communist in any way. But he was, as I say, I think based on his experience in Europe and the war, etc., he had a very, very strong moral compass. And of course, he knew that apartheid was completely wrong. But he also, I think, had a sense of self-preservation and wanted to look after his family. He didn't want to lead us down into any disaster. He didn't want to get his community into trouble. So he was actually very active on a personal level, but never in a way that kind of he would try, he never sought the limelight in any sense. And he also, the limelight didn't really find him either. I think that's true, which is why this book is so important, I think, to highlight that story. As you said, you need so many more books like this, because I think a lot of people were like him, just generally fundamentally decent people who felt they had to do the right thing. Now, actually, before I came here, what I thought I'd do is I'd look at the texts of some of the sermons that he gave to see what kind of messaging he was giving. And there are two very strong messages. The one is Zionism. Okay, he kind of said, well, everyone should actually go to Israel. And if you don't, you should encourage your children to. And I actually saw the text of that sermon he gave on my bar mitzvah, where he actually said that. Okay, but there was another clause which was always there. And he said the Jews have to teach humanity the fact that all human beings were created in the image of God. Okay, that's our duty. He very much felt that as a Jew, especially as a religious leader. Okay, he was out there with a moral message that had to be implemented. He felt kind of the burden of responsibility of having to be there and perform that role. So in East London, and I know this now just from a book that Rob Robertson wrote about his experiences, which I wouldn't have known otherwise, is that there was an organization then that exists today. I don't think it has quite the same bent today, but back then it was just really a liberal kind of, organization opposed to racism called the Institute of Race Relations, which, although very liberal and very tame, was like too much for the administration then to swallow, right? And my dad was very involved there. And apparently he was responsible for telling them, listen, you've got to get out of the back streets and get onto the high streets. My dad was quoted for saying that in the context there. I had no idea, but I just found this in a book. I discovered it in a book much later by the Reverend Robertson. And that whole environment, there was Donald Woods, who was the editor of the Daily Dispatch, and he was eventually, again, he was also in that kind of milieu of people at that time. So anyway, so speaking about childhood experiences, I used to be very proud when I went to nursery school in East London. And I used to love telling my friends that my dad was a really special guy. And why? Because he had friends who were policemen. Okay, I thought this was the coolest thing, like policemen with guns. Okay. And these policemen used to come to our house. And I thought, like, how many people can boast about that, right? That real policemen in uniforms come to their house with their guns and they sit around in our lounge. And my mum used to give them tea and cake. Okay. And I thought this was the most amazing thing. And I used to brag about this at kindergarten. Okay. And it took a while for me to understand that these meetings with the police, with the friends, okay, were actually like, these were warnings. These were intimidation tactics by the police at the time. And what my dad also relates from that time is that how, again, it was tame. Okay, he was talking about just getting involved in a multiracial church. We didn't have much scope for a multiracial shul back then in South Africa, right? But he was very interested in that aspect. And the Institute of Race Relations. The people used to come to shul. He says, people with very short haircuts, like big guys with short haircuts and dark glasses, and they would sit in the back making notes. And it was like they always stood out like sore thumbs. My dad said, but there was also some lecture he was giving somewhere, which was quite a full room of students. And he said there were but in the whole hall, there were only 2 people taking notes. So he thought, great, I'll have an interesting discussion afterwards, okay? Just before the end of the lecture, the 2 guys get up and walk out, right? My dad said to the students, well, what happened there? And they said, no, those are the security branch. Okay, they were just coming to monitor your sermons or your lecture.
That's amazing, because I think that's something that's run across, again, all our stories, particularly since we're now talking mostly to the children. Is this, and I mean, both of you mention it, this kind of disjunct between a child's view of the world and, which is this idyllic Lily's Leaf where people are shooting and making revolutionary stories, and your child's view of the world of this, of police, police officers and guns being a kind of exciting, glamorous thing. And really the incredible, for me, what really runs through it is incredible lengths actually the security police went to in South Africa to intimidate. Every story talks about the fact that people's phones were tapped, that there was quite visible. I imagine they weren't making a hell of an effort to disguise themselves when they were.
No, they didn't need to. They didn't actually need to.
They didn't need to, exactly.
That was the point, because
they had absolute power. It was a fascist state.
Exactly. And I really find it fascinating the way that runs through. And I don't want to, one of the last things, we're all running a bit out of time. And, in the book we talk about, Nina, you were a teacher, is that correct, at a school? And your students were being arrested.
Yes, well, it was a so-called private school at Catholic school, but we had a multiracial staff.
Okay.
I was only Jew on the staff. They soon got to know what a Jew was. Yes, and they did get arrested because they were going to form some protest rally. and they got arrested and came with the tanks and everything. Those poor girls were hysterical. And then we said, okay, they won't go. The leader said, we won't go to the rally. And then they arrested the leader.
So again, the levels of oppression were remarkable, and I'm going to just end with the story. I know I'm kind of giving it away, but end with the story in the book, which is where it gets its name from. There's one of the kids being arrested, and your father coming to the prison and saying he needs a Bible so he can pray, and the police officer or the prison's officer said he's got a Bible, and your father took out his kippah and he said he needs this to pray. And certainly all the stories I've heard of people who were detained, how powerful and important those moments to know that there was someone on the outside. And I think it just shows the empathy and compassion at a very small level, which is partly what this book is about, of recognizing the injustice of the detention and recognizing the need to connect also with the person who was detained. So I think we've got 1 minute for questions. I'll let, do you want to take over again?
I just want to say, Rabbi Benjamin, it's very, very interesting to hear about your dad. I confess, even though, not dropping names, but I'm one of the outspoken rabbis in that book.
Oh,
I'm Rabbi Selwyn.
oh, I remember you. I'm sorry I didn't make the
Well,
connection
thank you.
now.
I'm so pleased you're here. Thank
So I'm
you.
saying
that
what is interesting is that, of course, we did establish the organization Jews for Justice. And part of the motivation was radicalization of the Jewish community and the Judaization of the radical community, because we were aware, especially in those times, it was UDF involvement, and there were a lot of Jews even at that stage. And indeed, what concerned us deeply was the fact that there was a limited connection to the Jewish heritage, which now brings me to the question as to whether your dad, in your recollection, or whether your mum recollects, did your dad focus at all? We heard as to why Arthur Goldreich, for example, got involved in the Judaic dimension. Did your dad focus on some of the religious tenets when he was actively involved in trying to establish multiracial services?
Definitely, yes. Yeah, I would say that was his guiding light. Absolutely, his Jewish upbringing, his background, his tradition, his education, everything. That was the prime motivator behind it all. I think I can say that unreservedly. Also, he was very much involved in the interfaith sphere. In other words, he kind of thought that anybody who's represents a religion, all the religions were saying the same thing, might go about in a different way in terms of what should be. But that was kind of his arena, with Christian leaders and Muslim leaders. We have a picture at home of my dad lighting this candle outside St. George's Cathedral at an anti-apartheid gathering there. And there was a Christian leader there and a Muslim leader there as well. So that was, I would say, absolutely, it was definitely a completely 100% so. Yeah.
Can I just say, I think that's a fascinating question, and I actually think that all of the people that we talked about who were in the Communist Party, those Jewish people who I knew personally, had a real kind of Jewish chen. They had a Jewish sense of things. And I think that was absolutely, notwithstanding the fact that they were members of the Communist Party, in a way that was kind of, for the purpose of what I'm saying, kind of secondary. Actually, it was because they were Jews. That's my kind of
I was going to say
personal view of that.
There was a moral element, not necessarily a religious element, because our parents, both of them, were very anti-religious.
They were atheists.
They were militant atheists.
They were.
But there was a moral element. I said to my dad once something about, doing what he did for Black South Africans. He said, I didn't do it for Black South Africans. I did it for me. He couldn't stand the idea of living in that country as it was, and he wanted to change it. And my mother was exactly the same. And I think all their friends were, you know, and they put themselves at great risk in order to demonstrate that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for identifying yourself. Really, it's lovely to have you here in the audience as well. I'm going to move over to you again, because you know, thanks to all this wonderful conversation, I think we went a bit late.
Okay, so
And I know
I want
Wendy and Zev
to
also
really
want
want
to
to thank you.
Wendy and Zev also want to speak.
Right, and
Okay,
thank
great.
you. I want to thank Professor Karen Milner for handing the questions both to Paul and Nicholas. It's been wonderful to have you.
Greatest of pleasure.
And thank also Rabbi David Benjamin and family. Thank you also for your addition.